There was a report filed, a clear one, time-stamped, documented, submitted through every official channel available. The person who filed it did everything right. She used the correct form. She attached the screenshots. She described the timeline in precise detail. She waited, and nothing happened. Not because a server went down, not because the system was overwhelmed by some unprecedented catastrophe, not because the report got lost in some technical glitch that nobody could have anticipated. Nothing happened because the system received what she sent, evaluated it, and decided, through a process she would never be allowed to see, that it didn't meet the threshold for action. That decision took 4 minutes. She found out 11 days later, not through a notification, not through a follow-up from an analyst. She found out because someone appeared at her workplace. This is the story that never made it into the headlines. This is the version that gets buried under press releases about new safety frameworks and quarterly trust and safety reports and carefully worded statements about ongoing commitment to user protection. This is what actually happened. Inside the pipelines, inside the meetings, inside the documents that were never meant to be reviewed by anyone outside the building. And this is where things get dangerous, because what happened to her isn't a malfunction. It's a feature of a system that was designed at every critical decision point to protect itself before it ever considered protecting the people inside it. Stay with this, because by the end, you're going to understand exactly how it works, and you're going to understand why it could happen to anyone. In the spring of 2019, a woman living in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, a working mother of two, a mid-level project manager at a logistics firm, someone with no public profile, no political enemies, no history of conflict, that would have explained what was coming and began receiving messages. They started as comments, responses to posts she had made on a major social media platform. Comments that were aggressive, but taken individually, difficult to characterize as a direct threat. They escalated. Within 5 days, the accounts targeting her had posted her employer's name. Within 8 days, they had posted her children's school. Within 11 days, they had posted her home address alongside an explicit statement about what they intended to do. Her name was Rachel Mercer. She did everything the platform told her to do. She reported each account. She reported each post. She submitted a detailed harassment report through the platform's formal reporting tool, including screenshots of every message, a chronological account of the escalation, and a list of the 23 accounts she had identified as part of the coordinated campaign. She marked each submission as urgent. She requested human review. The platform's automated system responded within 4 minutes. After reviewing her submission, it had determined that the content did not violate community guidelines. Rachel appealed. That process took 3 days. The appeal was reviewed and the original decision was upheld. On the 12th day after her first report, a man she had never met walked through the front door of her employer's building and asked to speak with her by name. The police were called. A report was filed. An investigation opened. Law enforcement obtained a court order requiring the platform to provide user data on the accounts involved. Within 3 weeks, using the data the platform had possessed from the moment Rachel first reported, data the platform had not acted on, data the platform had reviewed in 4 minutes, and determined did not meet the threshold for action, investigators identified the primary account responsible for organizing the campaign. 3 weeks for law enforcement with a court order. 4 minutes for the platform's moderation system. The information was the same. The outcome was not. To understand what happened inside those 4 minutes, and why 4 minutes was all it took to make the wrong call, you have to go back further than Rachel Mercer's case. You have to go back to the decisions that made those 4 minutes possible, the decisions that made them inevitable. In the years following 2013, the major social media platforms experienced growth that defied almost every projection. User bases that had been measured in the hundreds of millions crossed into the billions. Content volume scaled in ways that rendered traditional moderation approaches structurally obsolete. A team of human analysts that might have been adequate for a platform with 50 million users became a rounding error at 500 million. At 5 billion, human review of even a fraction of reported content was mathematically impossible at any staffing level that a private company was willing to fund. The platforms responded to this challenge in the way that platforms respond to most challenges, with technology. They built automated moderation systems, machine learning classifiers trained on labeled datasets of policy-violating content, Algorithmic filters designed to catch the most common and most easily identifiable violations. Tiered review pipelines that routed content based on probability scores, pushing the clearest violations to immediate action, and filtering the ambiguous cases toward human review queues that were, by the late 2010s, already running backlogs measured in the tens of thousands. For the categories of harm these systems were designed to catch, they worked. Not perfectly, but well enough to generate the kind of metrics that looked good in investor presentations. Hundreds of millions of pieces of spam removed per quarter. Billions of fraudulent accounts detected and disabled. Hundreds of thousands of graphic violence violations actioned within hours of upload. These numbers were real. The systems that generated them were genuinely functional. And the people inside the platforms who built and operated them were, in the main, people who believed they were doing something important. But here's what the numbers obscured. Here's what the quarterly trust and safety reports consistently failed to capture in any meaningful way. Here's the gap that existed from the beginning and that the metrics were never designed to see. The automated systems were trained on individual pieces of content. A single image, a single post, a single comment. They were built to answer a simple question. Does this specific piece of content violate policy? That question works for spam. It works for graphic violence. It works for copyright infringement and for obvious hate speech, and for the categories of violation that exist independently of the relationship between the poster and the target. It does not work for coordinated harassment. Because coordinated harassment doesn't exist in individual pieces of content. It exists in the pattern. It exists in the relationship between 23 accounts posting over 11 days to a single target. It exists in the aggregate meaning of things that, taken individually, might each pass a policy review and, taken together, constitute something that should terrify anyone who understands what it means. The systems weren't built to see patterns, they were built to see posts. And that distinction, invisible in the metrics, invisible in the quarterly reports, invisible in every public statement about platform safety, is the structural origin of what happened to Rachel Mercer. This is where things change. Because this wasn't unknown. By 2017, the problem of coordinated harassment had been documented extensively in academic literature, in journalism, in victim advocacy reports, and in the internal research of the platforms themselves. The term coordinated inauthentic behavior was already in use inside platform policy teams. The patterns that defined it, multiple accounts, sustained targeting, gradual escalation, real-world intimidation, had been mapped and described with considerable precision. The platforms knew. Not in the vague, peripheral sense of having heard about a problem. They knew in the specific, documented sense of having commissioned research that identified the problem, quantified its scope, and outlined its consequences. What happened with that knowledge is one of the most consequential questions this case raises. In 2017, a major platform's internal trust and safety team completed an audit of their escalated review pipeline. The audit examined a specific category of cases, reports of multi-account coordinated targeting directed at private individuals. The audit found that these cases were generating false negative outcomes, meaning the reports were being reviewed, closed without action, and the targeting was continuing, at a rate significantly higher than any other category of reported harm. The audit recommended changes to the review protocol. Specifically, it recommended the creation of a dedicated review pathway for cases involving documented multi-account coordination with higher escalation priority and mandatory human review above a certain evidence threshold. Those recommendations went into a meeting. The meeting produced minutes. The minutes recorded that the recommendations had been discussed. They recorded that concerns had been raised about the resource implications of implementation. They recorded a decision to commission a follow-up analysis of the cost-benefit relationship between the proposed changes and the associated litigation risk. The follow-up analysis was never made public. The protocol changes were never implemented. 8 months after that meeting, a woman named Rachel Mercer filed her first report. And this is the moment you need to sit with. This is the moment that changes how you understand everything that comes after. Because the failure wasn't downstream. The failure wasn't in the 4-minute review or the automated classifier or the analyst who had too many cases to handle. The failure was upstream. It was in a room where people who understood the problem decided that understanding it was sufficient. That commissioning more analysis was an acceptable substitute for building the fix. By the time Rachel's report arrived in the pipeline, it had already been decided. Not maliciously, not through any single act of bad faith, but through the cumulative weight of deferred decisions. That her category of case was not a priority. Not because no one cared, because the system had been arranged so that caring was compatible with doing nothing. There is a researcher, a digital rights scholar at a university, whose name she asked not be used publicly in connection with ongoing legal proceedings, and whom we will call Dr. Allison Park, who spent 3 years documenting exactly how wide this gap was. Park began her research in 2019. She was studying platform moderation outcomes, specifically looking at the relationship between how reports were processed and what happened to the people who filed them afterward. Her methodology was painstaking. She worked through victim advocacy networks, civil court records, law enforcement reports, and the limited platform transparency data that was publicly available. She cross-referenced everything against a database of harassment reports she had collected through a network of digital rights organizations operating in the United States and the United Kingdom. By the time she had finished collecting data, she had 847 documented cases. Each case shared a specific set of characteristics. Each involved a targeted harassment campaign directed at a private individual. Each involved a report filed with a major platform with documented evidence that had been closed without action. Each involved real-world escalation, physical contact, workplace intrusion, home visitation, or documented threats that had crossed from online to offline within a 6-month window following the platform's decision not to act. 847 cases, 32 months of data, 4 platforms. The pattern was, in Park's own words, almost perfectly consistent. The reports that were closed fastest, the reports that received the shortest review time, that moved most efficiently through the moderation pipeline, were the reports that required the most context to understand. The ones involving coordinated campaigns across multiple accounts. The ones where the harm wasn't in a single post, but in the relationship between dozens of posts over days or weeks. Those were the reports the system was worst at processing, and those were the cases most likely to end in real-world escalation. Park prepared her findings for publication. She submitted her paper to 2 peer-reviewed journals. The first declined on methodological grounds she describes as procedurally unusual, the kind of feedback she had not received in 15 years of academic publication. The second journal accepted the paper and placed it in its upcoming issue. Then, approximately 6 weeks before publication, the paper was pulled. No formal explanation was provided to Park. What she eventually discovered, through a separate FOIA request directed at the university's communications office, which surfaced a partial email chain, was that one of the platforms included in her dataset had requested a meeting with the journal's editorial board. The email chain doesn't record what was said in that meeting. It only confirms that the meeting happened, that it was initiated by the platform's policy communications team, and that the paper was removed from the publication schedule within 10 days of the meeting taking place. The paper was never published through an academic journal. It eventually appeared in 2023 through a digital rights organization that operates independently of institutional partnerships and maintains no formal relationship with any of the platforms in her dataset. It received significant attention in specialist communities. It received almost no mainstream coverage. And this is where something doesn't add up. Because if a researcher with documented data, sourced from public records and verified through multiple independent channels, can have her work quietly removed from publication through a meeting that leaves almost no paper trail, then the question isn't just about one paper. The question is about how much other work didn't make it through. How many other findings are sitting in filing cabinets or on hard drives because the pathway to public attention passed through an institution that had reason to prefer silence? In 2021, a former trust and safety analyst named Claire Holloway testified before a Senate subcommittee examining platform moderation practices. Holloway had worked in the escalated review division of one of the largest social media companies in the world for 4 years. She had left the role 8 months before her testimony, and she spoke with the specificity of someone who had spent years inside the machinery she was describing. Her testimony covered a range of subjects: Most of the coverage it generated focused on content moderation decisions around political speech, a topic that was, at the time, generating substantial public debate. The section that received almost no press attention was the section about metrics. Holloway described a performance measurement system that had been introduced in her division approximately 18 months before she left. Every analyst was expected to close a minimum number of cases per shift. The target, when it was introduced, was 60 cases per 8-hour shift. Within 6 months, it had been raised to 90. Within a year, it was over 100. She did the arithmetic for the subcommittee. At 60 cases per shift, an analyst has approximately 8 minutes per case. At 100 cases, that drops to under 5. At the peak targets she had seen in her final months at the company, some analysts were processing over 120 cases per shift, which means under 4 minutes per case. At 8 minutes, Holloway told the subcommittee, "You can read what's in front of you and think about what it means. At 4 minutes, you look at the surface and you make a decision. You don't have time to look for what isn't there. You don't have time to think about what the pattern of this case looks like if you zoom out. You can only process what's directly in front of you." She was describing, with clinical precision, the mechanism by which Rachel Mercer's report had been closed in 4 minutes and found to be non-violating. The subcommittee asked her why the targets had been raised. She said the targets were set by product managers responding to pressure from VP-level leadership, responding to pressure from quarterly review metrics that measured cases processed, not outcomes achieved. The incentive wasn't to make better decisions. The incentive was to clear the queue, and clearing the queue faster meant the dashboard looked better in the next presentation. Holloway's testimony is in the congressional record. The subcommittee published a summary report 8 months later. The report recommended that platforms review their moderation metrics with an eye toward quality outcomes. No legislation followed. No platform publicly altered its closure rate targets. No regulatory body was empowered to verify whether any internal changes were made. The summary report has been downloaded, according to the subcommittee's own public statistics, fewer than 4,000 times. The platforms continue to publish quarterly trust and safety reports citing impressive numbers. Here is the cognitive shock this case demands you sit with. Here is the moment where everything you thought you understood about how this failure happened has to be reconsidered. The platforms were not operating in ignorance. They were not failing because the problem was invisible to them. The problem was visible. It was documented in internal audits. It had been quantified by internal researchers. It had been raised in meetings where senior people sat across tables from each other and discussed what to do about it. The choice, and it was a choice even if it was never recorded in a single memo as a clear, affirmative decision, was to respond to the documented problem with analysis rather than action, to commission more research, to form working groups, to build the apparatus of attention around the problem without building the solution. And while that apparatus was being built, while the follow-up analyses were being commissioned and the quarterly reviews were coming and going, the cases were arriving. Rachel Mercer's case arrived. 846 other cases arrived. They went into the pipeline. They received their 4-minute reviews. They were closed. The people who understood the problem and the people who experienced the consequences of the unfixed problem were operating in completely separate systems. They never made contact. They were never meant to. This is not a story about bad people making bad decisions. It's a story about a structure that was designed to keep those two populations, the people who knew and the people who were harmed, from ever occupying the same room at the same time. The civil case that eventually followed Rachel Mercer's workplace incident produced a set of legal filings that, taken together, constitute the most detailed public record of platform moderation decision-making that has ever been made available. The most significant of these filings was a declaration submitted by a platform engineer, under seal with portions subsequently redacted, though enough remained unredacted to be meaningful, which described the company's internal documentation practices around what it called high-risk harassment cases. High-risk harassment. The phrase itself is worth pausing on. The platform had a category, a defined, labeled, internally recognized category for cases where the potential for real-world harm was elevated. The category existed. The documentation practices existed. The review protocol for that category existed. What the engineer's declaration described was what happened before a case was assigned to that category. Before it could be classified as high risk, before it could be routed to the specialized review pathway, it had to pass through something the internal documentation called risk management review. Risk management review was not a moderation function, it was a legal function. Its purpose was not to assess the danger to the person who had filed the report. Its purpose was to assess the company's litigation exposure if the case was handled incorrectly. The criteria for risk management review included the public profile of the target, the level of press attention the case had received or was likely to receive, the severity of harm that had already occurred, and the estimated probability that the case would result in legal action against the platform. Cases involving private individuals with no public profile, where harm had not yet become physical, where press attention was absent, and where litigation risk was estimated as low, those cases were returned to the standard moderation pipeline. No escalation flag, no priority designation, no human reviewer with more than 4 minutes. Rachel Mercer was a private individual. The harm had not yet become physical when she filed her report. There was no press attention. The litigation risk at that moment was assessed as low. She went back into the queue. The engineer who signed the declaration had been involved in building parts of the risk management review system. The declaration makes clear that he understood what the system was designed to do and what it wasn't designed to do. He describes, in language that is careful and precise and clearly written by someone who spent a long time thinking about how to say this accurately, the gap between what the system called a high-risk case and what would actually qualify as a high-risk situation for the human being on the other end of the report. Those two categories, he wrote, overlapped imperfectly. The system's definition of high risk was a legal construct. The actual risk to the target was a human construct. They were not the same thing. They were never designed to be the same thing. There is a word that appears in the internal documents that have emerged through litigation, FOIA requests, and whistleblower disclosures across this period. It appears in product reviews and engineering specifications and policy frameworks and risk assessments. The word is acceptable. Acceptable false negative rate, acceptable escalation threshold, acceptable response time, acceptable litigation exposure. Every one of those phrases contains a decision, a real decision made by real people about what the system is willing to tolerate. An acceptable false negative rate means some percentage of genuine threats will be missed, and we have decided in advance that this percentage falls within bounds we can defend. An acceptable escalation threshold means some category of cases will not receive human review, and we have determined that category is narrow enough to be justified. An acceptable response time means some people will wait significantly longer than others for help, and we have concluded that the distribution of that waiting is defensible under the frameworks we operate within. These are not engineering decisions. Engineers implement decisions. These are policy decisions, ethical decisions, decisions about value, about whose safety counts, at what resolution, against what timeline, in comparison to what other priorities. And those decisions were made by people who were not in the room when Rachel Mercer filed her report. They were made in budget cycles and quarterly reviews and product planning sessions by people whose performance metrics measured how efficiently the pipeline moved, not what happened to the people inside it. The system worked exactly as it was designed. The metrics looked good. The dashboards were green. The quarterly report cited impressive throughput numbers. And 11 days after a woman submitted documented evidence of a coordinated campaign targeting her family, a stranger walked through the door of her workplace. The system worked. The outcomes it produced were the outcomes it was designed to produce. And in a legal department somewhere, in a risk management framework that had been built with considerable care, someone had already calculated that those outcomes were acceptable. In 2022, a separate set of documents emerged through a legal proceeding in a different jurisdiction. These documents weren't related to Rachel Mercer's case directly. They came from a class action filed by a coalition of harassment victims across multiple platforms, represented by a digital rights legal organization that had been building the case for 3 years. What those documents revealed, and what generated a brief flurry of coverage before being displaced by other news, was something that recontextualized everything that had come before. Beginning in approximately 2016, at least 2 of the major platforms had commissioned internal research specifically examining the relationship between moderation speed and escalation outcomes. The research asked a direct question: is there a measurable relationship between how quickly a harassment report is processed and whether the harassment subsequently escalates into real-world contact? Both research teams found the same directional result. Faster processing, specifically lower review time per case, was associated with higher rates of subsequent real-world escalation. The relationship wasn't subtle. It was consistent across the datasets. It replicated across platforms. It was, in the researchers' own characterization, robust. Both sets of research were classified as proprietary. Neither was shared with regulators. Neither was shared with legislators. Neither was shared with academic researchers or digital rights organizations, or any external body that might have acted on the findings. Both sets of research informed internal product decisions, not in the direction of slowing down the moderation pipeline, in the direction of developing more sophisticated automated systems that could process cases faster while reducing the proportion that required human escalation. The goal the research shaped was greater efficiency, more cases closed per analyst per shift, not better outcomes per case. The research wasn't ignored. That's the critical point. It was taken seriously. It was used. The findings were incorporated into product development cycles. They influenced engineering priorities and resource allocation decisions. They shaped the systems that would subsequently process millions of reports, just not in the direction that would have helped anyone who filed one of those reports. Because the internal research had confirmed something the platforms already understood intuitively, faster processing reduced costs and improved throughput metrics. Slower processing with better outcomes was more expensive and harder to measure. And in a system that was rewarded for the former and not held accountable for the latter, the choice wrote itself. By 2020, Rachel Mercer's civil case had entered discovery. The legal process of compelling the platform to produce internal documents had begun. And as that process unfolded over the following months, the picture that emerged wasn't the one anyone expected. It wasn't a picture of a company that hadn't cared. It was a picture of a company that had cared, had invested in understanding the problem, had generated genuine knowledge about what was failing and why, and had then built a structure in which that knowledge never translated into the changes that would have mattered. The deposition transcripts from that proceeding are extensive. Most of them are sealed. But the portions that were made public include an exchange that has stayed with every person who has read it carefully. A senior platform executive, not a junior analyst, not a mid-level manager, but someone with direct authority over the Trust and Safety Division, is being questioned about the company's internal research on harassment outcomes. The attorney asks directly whether the company's research had established a relationship between closure rate targets and escalation outcomes. The executive pauses. The transcript marks the pause as approximately 4 seconds. Then she says, "I'm not aware of any research that reached that conclusion in a definitive way." 4 seconds of silence. "I'm not aware of any research that reached that conclusion in a definitive way." Not, "that research doesn't exist." Not, "we found no such relationship. I'm not aware." And in a definitive way, a phrase doing enormous work in a very small space, carving out the distance between what the research showed and what she was being asked to confirm, leaving just enough room to be technically accurate while communicating almost nothing true. This is the language of a system protecting itself. It's not perjury. It's not deception in any simple sense. It's the careful, practiced, institutionally refined art of answering a question in a way that forecloses accountability without requiring dishonesty. And sitting on the other side of that deposition was a woman who had done everything right, who had filed the correct form, who had attached the screenshots, who had submitted the appeal, who had waited. In 2021, the same year Claire Holloway was testifying before the Senate, a coalition of victim advocacy organizations published a joint report on platform moderation failures. The report drew on testimony from over 300 individuals who had experienced what the report called enforcement gaps, situations in which documented harassment reports had been closed without action and the targeting had subsequently continued or escalated. The report contained one finding that received very little attention at the time, but that, in retrospect, is arguably the most significant data point in the entire public record on this subject. Among the 300 individuals whose cases were examined, the average number of reports filed before experiencing real-world escalation was not 1 or 2. It was 14 14 separate reports submitted over an average period of 22 days before the harassment crossed from online into physical contact. 14 reports, each one reviewed, each one closed, each one generating the same automated response. After reviewing your submission, we have determined that the content does not violate our community guidelines. The people filing those reports weren't inexperienced users who didn't know how to navigate the system. Many of them had done extensive research on how to file effective reports. Many of them had consulted with advocacy organizations. Some of them had sought legal advice. They were doing everything they were told. They were following every instruction. They were filing report after report after report. And the system was processing them and closing them with the same algorithmic efficiency it brought to spam detection and copyright violations, at a speed that made genuine review impossible and with criteria that had been designed to identify individual violations rather than cumulative patterns. 14 reports. Average. Some people in the dataset had filed more than 40. This is the human arithmetic behind the acceptable false negative rate. This is what the metric looks like when you translate it from percentage points into lived experience. 40 reports, each one reviewed in 4 minutes. Each one returned with the same answer. 40 attempts to get the system to see what is directly in front of it. 40 failures that were not failures from the system's perspective, because the system was working exactly as designed. There is something that Dr. Park said in a 2023 interview that has not been quoted anywhere in the coverage of her work because the interview was conducted for a small digital rights podcast with an audience of a few thousand. She said it in the context of describing what she found most difficult about the years she spent on this research. She said, "The hardest part wasn't finding the data was there. The hardest part was understanding that the people who built these systems weren't villains. Most of them were people who genuinely believed they were doing something important. Some of them were doing something important. The system wasn't built by bad actors. It was built by people responding rationally to the incentives they operated within. And that's what makes it so difficult to fix. You can't fix it by finding the bad actor and removing them. There's no bad actor. There's an architecture. And the architecture is built around protecting something other than the people inside it. An architecture built around protecting something other than the people inside it. This is the most precise description of the structural failure at the center of this case. Not negligence, not malice. Architecture. A system of decisions made over years by people at different levels of different organizations, each of whom was responding rationally to their immediate context. And the sum of those rational responses was a machine that processed reports of human danger with the same logic it applied to reports of spam. Because both were, from the architecture's perspective, the same problem. Both were items in a queue. Both had to be reviewed and resolved. The metric didn't care what the item was. The metric cared how fast it moved. In late 2023, following years of public pressure, several legislative proposals, and a series of legal defeats that had begun to make the platform's litigation exposure on this specific category of harm significantly more real, the major platforms published updated trust and safety frameworks. The announcements were detailed. The language was serious and considered. They described new investments in human review capacity, new escalation pathways for high-risk cases, new partnerships with victim advocacy organizations, new training programs for moderation staff, new commitments to transparency around moderation outcomes. The announcements were carefully read by Dr. Park, by Claire Holloway, by the legal teams that had spent years in discovery on these cases, by the victim advocacy organizations that had compiled the data in the joint report. And what all of them noticed, independently without coordination, was the same absence. The announcements didn't describe the new metrics. They described intentions. They described investments. They described partnerships and commitments and frameworks. But they did not describe how the success of the new frameworks would be measured. They did not describe what the new closure rate targets were. They did not describe the new escalation thresholds. They did not describe the new criteria for risk management review, or whether risk management review still preceded escalation to human analysts, or whether the internal research that had documented the relationship between processing speed and escalation outcomes would now be shared with external researchers. They described what the system would value. They did not describe how the system would be structured to produce it. And this, again, is a pattern. Because in 2017, before the civil cases, before the Senate testimony, before Dr. Park's suppressed research, in 2017, the platforms had also published trust and safety frameworks. They had also described new investments and new commitments and new partnerships. The language in those 2017 announcements and the language in the 2023 announcements is, in structure and in substance, almost identical. Not because the same people wrote both, because the same incentive structure produced both. When accountability is measured by the quality of the public statement rather than the quality of the outcomes, the public statement becomes the product. And the platforms had spent years becoming very good at that product. What does Rachel Mercer's case look like from the endpoint, knowing everything that is now part of the public record? It looks like this. A woman in Ohio encountered a coordinated harassment campaign and responded exactly as she was supposed to. She used the tools the platform provided. She followed the instructions she was given. She trusted the system. The system, at every decision point, was not designed around her. It was designed around throughput metrics that had been set in quarterly reviews. It was designed around risk management criteria that assessed litigation exposure before it assessed human danger. It was designed around an internal research apparatus that had documented its own failures and incorporated those findings into product development in a direction that made the failures more efficient, not less frequent. The system was designed around the assumption that an acceptable false negative rate was a technical specification rather than a description of a certain number of people who would be harmed in ways that were predicted, quantified, and decided to be within bounds. Rachel Mercer was inside the bounds, until she wasn't. Until the harm became physical and the litigation risk became real and the calculus changed. And by then, the system had already done what it was built to do. The case had been processed. The queue had moved forward. The dashboard had stayed green. The quarterly numbers had looked good in the presentation. It worked. Every part of it worked. That's the part that should stay with you. Claire Holloway left the platform in 2020. Since then, she has been working with a coalition of victim advocacy organizations and digital rights researchers to develop what they call an outcome transparency framework, a proposed regulatory requirement that would compel platforms above a certain user threshold to publish quarterly reports on a specific, defined set of outcome metrics. Not closure rates, not cases processed, not time to resolution, escalation rates. The percentage of closed harassment reports in which the targeting subsequently continued or escalated, harm continuation rates. The percentage of cases in which the person who filed the report experienced real-world contact within a specified window following the platform's decision not to act, and cross-referencing made available to independent researchers. The relationship between processing speed, escalation decisions, and subsequent harm outcomes. This framework has been presented to legislators. It has been submitted to regulatory bodies. It has been discussed in committee hearings on both sides of the Atlantic. It has not been introduced as binding legislation in any jurisdiction that would affect the major platforms. The platforms have not publicly opposed it. They have engaged with it through the mechanism they have perfected over years of regulatory engagement, the working group. They have participated. They have sent representatives to meetings. They have expressed their commitment to the goals the framework is designed to achieve. Nothing has been implemented. The working groups continue. This is not cynicism. This is the documented pattern of how the gap between institutional knowledge and meaningful change has been maintained across nearly a decade of identified failures. Not through resistance, through engagement, through the apparatus of attention that substitutes for the apparatus of action. There is a final document in the public record of Rachel Mercer's case that has received almost no attention. It emerged late in the discovery process, and it was referenced in subsequent litigation. And it has never been reported on in any outlet with significant reach. It is a set of meeting minutes from a cross-functional review session at the platform, dated approximately 8 months before Rachel filed her first report. The session was convened to discuss findings from an internal audit of the escalated review pipeline. The audit had examined the specific category of case that Rachel's report would later represent: coordinated, multi-account targeting of private individuals. The audit had found that these cases were generating false negative outcomes at a significantly elevated rate. The audit had recommended protocol changes. The meeting had discussed those recommendations. The minutes record that concerns were raised about resource implications. They record a decision to commission a follow-up analysis examining the cost-benefit relationship between the proposed changes and the associated litigation risk. They record that the follow-up analysis would be reviewed at the next quarterly business review. There is no record of what the follow-up analysis concluded. There is no record of whether it was presented at the quarterly review. There is no record of any protocol change following from it. There is a record that 8 months later, Rachel Mercer filed her first report. 8 months. Between the moment someone inside the building documented the problem and the moment she submitted her screenshots. Between the meeting where people who understood the failure discussed it and the day it happened to her. Between the knowledge and the consequence. Between the room where the decision wasn't made and the pipeline that processed her report in 4 minutes and returned it as non-violating. 8 months of space. And in that space, nothing moved. The follow-up analysis was commissioned. The quarterly review came. Another quarterly review came. The metrics stayed green. The dashboards looked good. The closure rates were within target. The false negative rate was acceptable. And then Rachel Mercer filed her report. And then the stranger appeared at her door. The investigation is over in the limited sense that investigations end. The civil case resolved. The Senate testimony became part of the congressional record. The research eventually found its way into the public domain through channels that couldn't be easily blocked. The platforms published new frameworks. And somewhere in an office park or a downtown campus or a data center that processes millions of requests per day, the queue is moving. Reports are arriving. Each one is being processed. Each one is receiving a review. The time varies, sometimes 4 minutes, sometimes more, sometimes less. The criteria vary. They always vary in the documents that describe them and in the reality of how they're applied. The outcomes vary, but the architecture is the same architecture. The metrics measure what they've always measured. The risk management framework still precedes the escalation pathway. The internal research that documents the relationship between processing speed and harm outcomes is still proprietary. The follow-up analyses are still being commissioned. And someone, right now, is filing a report. She has the screenshots. She has the timestamps. She has documented 11 days of a coordinated campaign that has posted her address and her employer's name and the name of her children's school. She has followed every instruction. She is using the right form. She is waiting. And this is the question that stays open. Not whether this happens, it happens. 847 documented cases across 32 months. 14 reports on average before real-world escalation. The data is not contested. It is not ambiguous. It exists. The question that stays open is what it would take for the architecture to change. Whether the incentive structure that produced it is capable of producing something different without external pressure, sufficient to make the current structure more expensive than the alternative. Whether the working groups and the regulatory engagements and the new framework announcements are the beginning of that pressure, or the mechanism by which that pressure is absorbed and redirected before it reaches the decision-making layer where it would need to arrive to make a difference. Because here is what the evidence suggests, taken in full. The problem is understood. It has been understood for years. The relationship between how reports are processed and what happens to the people who file them is not a mystery. It is documented inside the buildings where the decisions are made. In research that was produced by the people who built the systems, the knowledge exists. The question has never been whether the problem is known. The question is whether the system is built to act on that knowledge in the direction of the people it is supposed to serve, or whether it is built to act on that knowledge in the direction of the institution that contains it. The answer, across nearly a decade of documented evidence, has been consistent. And the most disturbing part of that consistency isn't what it says about any single company or any single decision or any single person. It's what it says about every system that is allowed to set its own acceptable thresholds. Every institution that is permitted to define success in terms that it controls and measures in ways it designs. Every framework that is built to be defensible rather than effective, and that by being defensible, makes it nearly impossible for the people harmed by its failures to reach the layer of accountability where the design decisions were made. If this happened here, With documentation, with Senate testimony, with civil litigation, with academic research, with whistleblower declarations, with every mechanism of public accountability that theoretically exists for exactly this purpose, then the question isn't just about this case. The question is, how many other cases are running the same architecture right now? How many other reports are in queues measured by the wrong metrics, reviewed in time windows designed for throughput rather than understanding, filtered through risk management criteria that put the institution's exposure ahead of the human being's safety? How many other follow-up analyses are sitting between the meeting where the problem was documented and the protocol change that would have addressed it? How many other people are waiting for a response that the system has already decided, by design, is not coming? The case is closed. The pattern isn't. And that may be the most important thing this investigation has revealed. Not what happened to Rachel Mercer, but the precise and replicable mechanism by which it was allowed to happen. And the evidence that the mechanism is still running, still processing, still returning the same answer in 4 minutes, still generating the same green dashboard and the same quarterly numbers, while somewhere, on the other side of a report form, someone is still waiting. The question isn't whether it happened, it's whether you're next. Blackfile investigations, we don't just tell stories. We investigate, analyze, and reveal.